Hare Namaha. There are perspectives you need in order to really conceptualize and assimilate what went down in Prabhupada's branch of the Hare Krishna movement after he departed physical manifestation. You will not get any of these perspectives from the air quotes ISKCON movement, nor can either Neomat or Ritvik help you to attain them. These perspectives crystallize understanding of the actual narrative of the saga in accurate context, leading to further progress in genuine spiritual life. The history of anything, big or small, is generally based upon the interplay of powerful personalities in conjunction to events. We would certainly find this to be the case in the history of the Western world just prior to the colonization of America by European citizens. Just to give one example of many, the Peace of Westphalia was a major event that has ramifications and repercussions effective to this day everywhere in the West. It created a new paradigm. But how many people are even aware of this event, the Peace of Westphalia? Of course, our study here is almost entirely focused upon the Hare Krishna movement, and all of us could name and acknowledge any number of major and important events in its timeline. Prabhupada's arrival, the establishment of his first center, his first initiations, the incorporation of ISKCON, the Columbus Standing Lecture and Kirtan, the creation of the Governing Body Commission, etc. Yet there were events, both during his presence and the aftermath, that were just as important, but are mostly unrecognized today as being such. The aborted attempt to centralize his movement, the centralization scheme, by aid of the GBC in 1972 would be one such example. We have discussed it repeatedly over the decades in our articles, videos, and podcasts. As such, we have not allowed it to merge into oblivion. It was not, for all practical purposes, even known about by any but a handful of leading secretaries when it went down, and when it was on the verge of accomplishing, if Prabhupada had not, in very forceful terms, aborted it before it could gain traction, what it was on the verge of accomplishing would have been disastrous. The centralization scheme of 1972. Almost entirely, it became known to the rank and file well after Prabhupada had already left the scene. But the secretaries and temple presidents knew about it in April of 1972 when it was nipped. They kept it a secret. This is a good example of what I shall be communicating to you today. I shall be discussing an event of major importance that went down in Ramanreti, India at the Krishna-Balaram Center in the first weeks of 1979. Many of you do not know of it, but that will not remain the case now. Of those of you who know about it as an event, but know little else otherwise, that will also change when you finish assimilating this month's podcast. Be assured, virtually none of the rank and file in today's so-called ISKCON know about it. You will soon understand why that must be the case. As far as Neomut and Ritvik are concerned, most of their followers, and even some of their leaders, do not know about it. What to speak of its actual repercussions in terms of historical cause and effect. However, despite its relative anonymity, you cannot put the pieces of the puzzle of the narrative together without knowing this event. What went down, why, what was the antecedent leading up to it, and most importantly, what it actually accomplished. That is what you must know. It somewhat indirectly led to today's rise of the independence that many of you are taking advantage of, but could not otherwise have done so. In other words, because, whether you acknowledge it or not, today's general freedom in Krishna consciousness is again, at least indirectly, dependent upon that event of 1979. We continue with our chapter-by-chapter analysis of Henry Doktorski's 11 Naked Emperors, hereinafter ENE as its acronym. And we have now reached chapter 8, entitled Crushing the Opposition. A succinct and accurate title. Let us say that this chapter had not been included in his book. Let us postulate, theoretically, that the book had skipped this almost unknown event and went straight to the effective rebellion of the North American temple presidents in their toppling of the Zonal Acharyas, toppling all of that obscene worship and power falsely bestowed upon them. Would anyone have noticed that this event was missing? Hardly anybody knows about the subject of chapter 8, but everyone in or out of so-called ISKCON knows the history of the President's Rebellion and the installation of the Second Transformation, led by Ravindra Swarup. Yes, he was a temple president, and what he brought in other words, the collegiate compromise. The relative obscurity of what preceded the Second Transformation, and therefore led to it, has not been skipped by ENE. Now you are going to receive even more specifics about this event, allowing you to understand the repercussions and ramifications that it spawned. Before we get into any or all of those specifics, many, but not all, of them covered by chapter 8, an important, nay, essential point must be made and assimilated by the listeners and readers of this month's podcast. In a nutshell, it's this. You must acknowledge and realize that confronting the leadership of any cult, and we only deal with Krishna cults here, such confrontation is not the same as attacking Krishna consciousness itself. A confrontation can be an attack, granted, but it is not necessarily so. In the case of the event in the winter of 1979 in Ramanreti at the Krishna-Balaram Mandir, the 11 zonals were attacked, you could say. But really they were confronted for the first time by a handful of their godbrothers, which can be called the opposition for the sake of the excellent title chosen by Doktorski for chapter 8. they were punished in different ways for that so-called attack. They were cursed. The vast majority of them were forced to humiliate themselves and publicly apologize to the quote-unquote new gurus in front of the whole assembly. Of course, when we say forced, they were intimidated, but not technically forced, because some didn't apologize. As a side note, your host speaker and 3 others of the 36 signatories on the document did not humiliate himself, and I did not apologize. There was nothing to apologize for, and I did not do so. This made my life very tough as far as the so-called Krishna movement was concerned, obviously, and I was singled out in the GBC resolutions of 1979 for allegedly promulgating, quote-unquote, poisonous activities. The Zonals fully deserved to be confronted, or if you prefer, attacked. They actually had no legitimate basis for what they had done and what they were doing in the late 70s. They had hijacked the movement by taking over the vitiated GBC and dovetailed its imprimatur to rubber stamp their so-called appointment to Guru, Diksha Guru. It was an appointment that never was. Prabhupada only appointed 11 Ritviks in the second week of July 1977 in a written notice to all temple presidents that he did not dictate. That was no big deal. As I just mentioned, he did not even dictate the one-page document. It was drawn up by TKG, who, intent to include his close buddy Bhavananda as one of the 11, of course in the beginning it was one of the 9, had to hear and watch Prabhupada check TKG by also adding Hansaduta, who TKG abhorred. Of course, that sentiment was mutual, but there was no clause in the document stating that these Ritviks would then automatically become Diksha Gurus after Prabhupada departed physical manifestation. Yet, TKG was confident that this is what he could pull off when that time inevitably came, when Prabhupada left, even sooner than most expected. It was TKG's document as his initial effort to manipulate the Ritviks into Diksha Gurus. Prabhupada merely signed the one-page document on a line labeled approved. TKG was the person who actually signed it, since it was his letter. However, no one knew this. It is even somewhat debatable that the other 10 Ritviks knew that Prabhupada never appointed any of them as Diksha Gurus. It is possible, if not probable, that they believed the hype that Prabhupada appointed Gurus in July of 1977, what to speak of the inarguable fact that everyone else in the movement believed it. Actually, it was not even a question of belief. It was an accepted fact movement-wide. But it was not a fact. It was a big lie. As such, the document, which was issued to confront these so-called Acharyas in the winter of 1979 at Ramanreti, unfortunately conceded that they were all appointed as Diksha Gurus, despite the fact that none of them were appointed by Prabhupada to the post. That this error was contained in the confrontation paper should be understood in that overall context that I just explained. Nevertheless, the error weakened the document because presentation in confrontation, especially, had to be mistake-free in order for it to be fully potent, which it wasn't. TKG basically chose not to speak during the confrontation, which was divided into 2 sessions by a very unnecessary lunch break. Something as important as it was supposed to be, but TKG insisted during the session, the first session, that it be so divided so that everyone, especially it is presumed the enjoyer new gurus, could relish some lunch prasadam. The other time he spoke was when he bellyached about Pradyumna announcing to the assembly that he, Pradyumna, was leaving it. And let me tell you, when TKG whines, it's a most disgusting, nauseating, and agitating sound made by man. Pradyumna, I've traveled thousands of miles for this, and now you're leaving to attend to your deities? Although Pradyumna did not and does not have a warrior bone in his body, he can be adamant once he makes up his mind, and he was. Despite the belly aching, he was justified to leave, and he made the decision to leave. The word decision comes from the Latin root desere, which means to cut. When you make a decision, you cut off any and all options which are not part of that decision. Hridayananda had decided to play the emote and degrade card from the bottom of the deck in his debate with Pradyumna. Hridayananda, in the beginning, was losing the debate. That was clear. And you could feel the consternation of the zonals in that atmosphere of faithlessness and antagonism. Hridayananda picked up on it. He knew he was losing, so he decided to throw down. A very proud man, he knew he could overlord Pradyumna emotionally because Pradyumna was strong intellectually, but had no real following, did not have disciples, and was fully Brahminical. Hridayananda decided that the debate should degenerate into conflict, and that was that, after about 10 minutes of debate that was somewhat genuine. Pradyumna had no chance once the parameters of the debate, which was not a debate anymore when Hridayananda emoted, once those parameters had radically changed into a kind of rancor. Hridayananda shouts, "Who cares about the Ramanuja Sampradaya? Are you saying that you know more than us? Are you saying that Prabhupada's selected men, his gurus, are to be subordinate to you?" That's when everything broke down. Now, this may not be exactly the word-for-word translation according to my memory, but it's very close to it, I can assure you of it. As such, Pradyumna gave up on them, and he also gave up leading the confrontation and the debate. And let me tell you, no one else could take his place. Yaçodanandan could not do so. He had been Guru Kripa's wingman for years, and he was no match for Hridayananda. Debate was not within the wheelhouse of his expertise. Guru Kripa had completely failed to show. He could have went toe for toe with any of them, including Hridayananda, but instead, he was in Western Europe getting incarcerated at a Netherlands penitentiary for drug dealing. Because after all, he should have been there. After all, he was the GBC for the Krishna-Balaram Mandir. After all, he was the central man that got the whole thing started. He was the one who earlier the previous year had successfully confronted both Bhagavan and Bhavananda when they demanded the inmates at Krishna-Balaram worship them. Guru Kripa said no. He said no to big seats. He said no to foot worship, padapuj. Oh yeah. He said no to any kind of special worship for these men. He rejected the pomp and circumstance of the zonal acharya takeover, and he could confront with the best that any of those so-called zonal acharyas could offer, but he didn't. He was gone. He left it to Yaçodanandan, who did not have Guru Kripa's confrontational skills. Nor was Yaçoda an abrasive personality. He was a pukka sannyasi at that time, while Guru Kripa was anything but, even though technically he was sannyas. The man of the hour should have been Guru Kripa, but he turned out to be an epic fail when push came to shove. Once Pradyumna defied all of them and left the Asat Sabha, Yaçoda was no match, Akshayananda was no match, and Johnny-come-lately Jagat Guru was also no match. 2 and 4, the bellicosity that many of the 11 then unleashed, led by Hridayananda, and the rout was on. E.N.E. describes all of this in Chapter 8. So let us now segue to some of those excerpts in the book in Chapter 8. Your host speaker, as was the case in Chapter 7, is quoted also in Chapter 8 quite liberally, but none of those quotes will be reproduced here in this month's KCD Monthly Podcast. Quote, finally, Yaçodanandan Swami challenged the Zonal Acharyas to a debate at the February 1979 GBC meetings in Vrindavan, India. Kailasa Candra, who was regarded as a philosophical pundit, was asked to write a position paper for the challengers. 2 years earlier, in 1977, Kailasa Candra had served as the personal secretary for Balavanta Das, an aspiring politician and president of the Atlanta Temple. Kailasa Candra recalled, quote, it was there that I was privy to the politics that was going down amongst the power players just prior to and just after the implementation of the Zonal Acharya scam, unquote. In preparation for the debate, the Vrindavan Temple president, Akshayananda, gave Kailasa Candra a typewriter and a room at the Krishna-Balaram Mandir. When Kailasa Candra completed his 20-page paper, Yaçodanandan Swami, who was respected for his strict sadhana, canvassed 36 devotees to sign it. The paper was copied and presented to the Zonal Acharyas prior to the debate. Ravindra Swarup confirmed, quote, in 1979, questions about the Guru's position had burst out in major eruptions at ISKCON centers at Vrindavan and Juhu Beach, ejecting over the rest of the movement thick facsimiles of photocopied papers, unquote. Although Yaçodanandan had issued the challenge to debate the new gurus, and Kailasa Candra had written their position paper, it was Pradyumna, a scholar whose knowledge of logic and Shastra was formidable, who was chosen to be the spokesman for the Reform Party. All 11 new gurus showed up for the Vrindavan debate, and the atmosphere was tense. The chief points of contention by the reformers were, 1. The new gurus were not entitled to accept worship from their godbrothers and or godsisters. 2. Any worship of the new gurus should be held in some kind of private quarters, not in front of the deities in a temple established by Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. 3. The worship of the new gurus was far too lavish, and they did not deserve to accept such worship whatsoever. 4. To perpetuate the line of ISKCON, The current arrangement for disciplic succession, parentheses, by the GBC, which was dominated by the Acharya board, parentheses, was a counterproductive concoction and had to be immediately reversed before it was too late. 5. There were other godbrothers who deserved to be able to initiate new disciples into Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada's branch of the disciplic succession, and some kind of accommodation needed to be made. The strategy of the reform group relied in great measure on the presentation of Pradyumna, who would represent them in the debates. They also relied upon the confrontation remaining civil and conducted in Brahminical fashion, but unfortunately for the reformers, the debate was not conducted this way except during the first 10 minutes, unquote. So this long excerpt I read is from Doktorski in his book. Even though there's other quotes, 2 other quotes mixed into it, it's Doktorski's excerpt. Of course, the author of ENE, Doktorski, was not present for this meeting, and I was only present for the first half of it. The first half, however, was immeasurably more important than what went down after the lunch break, as that was nothing but an apology fest. Only males at Krishna-Balaram were approached for their signatures. All of the male devotees residing at the complex signed it except for Rupa Vilas. He, on the contrary, made substantial efforts to undermine its initiative. I could go into minute detail about all of that intrigue, but for now I'm choosing to just go into some of the details. Treachery and betrayal at the Raman Reti complex preceded the arrival of the Zonals. Such was not just in relation to a suggestion, adopted briefly then reversed, made by Rupa Vilas. Treachery and betrayal also took place at Bombay, Juhu Beach, where TKG arrived early and turned Giriraj around from a pillar of the opposition aligned with Yaçoda and Pradyumna to a loyalist with Ocean's 11. That, however, was not known until the meeting ensued. Tatvamasi. As far as the Raman Reti treachery was concerned, Yaçodanandan, then Swami, resorted to a sickness ploy in order to gain sympathy and rejuvenate all the local signatories who Rupa Vilas had briefly turned back onto the position paper. I never wavered, nor did the men who were part of my team at that time, but most of the others did, in fact all of them. Of course, Yaçoda could not convince Rupa Vilas to sign it, and he reported all that went down to Satsvarup upon his arrival at the complex, probably the first to reach there of the gurus, so-called gurus. Yaçoda had sent a mutual friendly, one of the signers, to find me in Varanasi in January 1979. The message that young man carried was a request to meet with him, Yaçoda, at Raman Reti and discuss how to confront this situation going down worldwide in the form of the Zonal acharya takeover. I was willing to oblige. Yaçodanandan got approval to set me up in my own room. I banged away on a typewriter at the document for hours each day, and on most days, Yaçoda would come to my room and read what I had typed. He agreed with virtually all of my writing and proposals. There was little to negotiate between us. We were of the same intelligence, and he took particular delight in the format that I had employed for the position paper. His secretary, personal secretary, then typed up the formal document, although she expressed her unhappiness in receiving that assignment. Yaçoda got all of the initial signatures from Krishna-Balaram. I signed the document as the 15th signature. Pradyumna did not sign it. He read it. He was not at the Krishna-Balaram Mandir. He was living in downtown Vrindavan. He read it. He told me he liked it, but in case it had a flaw somewhere, and actually it had 2 of those flaws, he did not want to risk that being exploited by the Zonals in order to take away his assignment from Prabhupada to continue the translation of the Bhagavatam. Turns out that went down anyway. They punished him for having the audacity to confront Hridayananda in debate. And as it turned out, the GBC took away Pradyumna's seva and gave it to that very man, Hridayananda. That tells you, in one sense, all you need to know about the ethics of those 11 men. It was the ethics of the savage. In other words, if it's good for me, it's good. And if it's good for me and bad for you, it's even better. I was pounced upon by Jayatirtha at the very end of the first session of the meeting. The buffalo stampede was on by that time, and it would only increase exponentially from what I heard reports about it, the second session, after that frivolous lunch break. However, I noticed something just as things were breaking down in the first session, after Hridayananda emoted. 2 of the zonals, only one of which spoke, were not approving how the other 9 were crushing the opposition. Now, it wasn't all of the other 9, because some of them didn't say anything. Bhavananda, Bhagavan, they didn't say anything. But how we were being crushed was not approved by Hare Krishna. She spoke up about it, imploring the other men to listen to the points being made, that there was validity in many of them. And the second man was Hamsaduta. He did not speak, but his facial and bodily gestures conveyed quite a bit. It was clear that he was intuitively picking up that this was the beginning of the end. He was picking up that despite all of this going down in Prabhupada's quarters of the complex, that His Divine Grace did not at all approve of how the opposition was being treated. Hamsaduta's dread of the eventual situation proved to be justified in the long run. The position paper was not perfect, but it deserved a completely different response. The opposition deserved to be respected and their points heard. Yet Paramatma wanted more than this. He wanted the zonals to be destroyed, and it would take some time. This was the first crack in the dam, but that would not be recognized until the summer of 1980, when the second crack emerged, and yes, I was heavily involved in widening that crack as well. Paramatma recognized the 2 flaws in the opposition's position paper. One has already been mentioned, namely the concession, which never should have been made, that Ocean's 11 had been appointed by Prabhupada as Diksha Gurus. We've already covered that flaw adequately. Everyone in the room that fateful day believed it, although TKG knew very well that it was not true. TKG knew that Prabhupada had only appointed 11 Ritviks, not gurus. He made that clear in December of 1980, but that's a whole other story. The position paper, the confrontation paper of 1979, granted all of them guru status And Paramatma was not satisfied with that. The appointment that never was would first be exposed in the summer of 1980 in a big way, but time had not yet changed that major misconception that they had been appointed gurus when they weren't. The second flaw in the document was urging the 11 zonals to once again go to Swami B.R. Sridhar for bad advice. Of course, the document didn't say bad advice, but that's all that the guy gave. Were the 14 points made by the plaintiffs bona fide? He should be asked this. Should they be given due consideration? He should be asked this. Everyone, or most everyone, was still bamboozled by the Navadvip Mahant in February of 1979. He was still considered, very wrongly, to be an elder godbrother of Prabhupada who was Prabhupada's well-wisher. Most definitely, that was not the case, but no one recognized that harsh fact at the time. As such, the position paper advocated a resort for more bad advice that should have never been suggested in the document. The opposition was thus punished for doing so by being wiped out, stampeded, routed, with myself also being scapegoated by Jayatirtha just before the lunch break. E.N.E. continued in Chapter 8, quote, "The 11 revealed, by their behavior during the debate, that they were most likely not on the topmost Uttama Adhikari platform of spiritual development as they claimed. In a Srimad Bhagavatam purport written a few years later, there's this entry. Being puffed up by his own ceremonial worship, a Kanishta Adhikari cannot imagine that anyone is more pious or religious than he, and the Kanishta Adhikari is not even aware that other devotees are more advanced. Thus, he cannot understand the Madhyam or Uttama standard of devotional service, and sometimes, because of his false pride, he criticizes the more advanced devotees of the Lord, neglects them, or simply has no understanding of their exalted position as preachers or completely self-realized souls," unquote. There's flaws in this excerpt from Doktorski. It makes some good points, but it's quite flawed. Actually, the 11 great pretenders were far from neophytes. They were all Sahajis by that time that the confrontation rolled around in Raman Reti. They were all taking undeserved worship in front of open deities on elevated imitation Vyasasans. They were all accepting Mahabhagavat adulation from not only their improperly initiated disciples, but also from their own godbrothers and godsisters. The position paper pointed out this discrepancy, and that fact deeply irritated them. This was because their delusion was so great that they'd actually forgotten that in the beginning, they all intentionally decided to imitate Prabhupada, which is completely forbidden. Follow in the footsteps, but don't imitate. They had bought into the so-called legitimacy of their show bottle imitation, and under the influence of Mahamoha, they believed themselves to be pure devotees. In that connection, E.N.E. shared this anecdote. Quote, "In the end, Guru Kripa, Pradyumna, Yaçodanandan, Kailasa Candra, and a number of others who challenged the Zonal Acharyas in Vrindavan, India, all left or were forced out of ISKCON. Guru Kripa explained, quote, most people, including ISKCON devotees, are basically Shudras who want a master to tell them what to do. They do not have sufficient intelligence or spiritual knowledge, accepted what the Zonal Acharyas demanded, and the more realized devotees left after trying to correct things. They were told to leave because they were disturbing the faith of the new disciples. because they could not take it anymore, they left, unquote. This was the developing situation at that time. You could argue that 1979 was the peak of the power of the zonals. No reform was at all likely, because the centers had been stacked with improperly initiated disciples. The godbrothers who accepted the new arrangement were allowed to stay, but the command and control was now shifting to the new people. The zonals simply wanted to travel and enjoy all the luxuries made ever ready to them everywhere in their zone. They parlayed all the work and promulgation activities off to their favorable godbrothers in the beginning. Still, the zonals knew that, on the whole, they could never really and fully trust them, the godbrothers. By 1979, the newcomers were becoming influential and sometime soon would even themselves become temple presidents. This anomaly was addressed to a significant degree in the position paper, of course. The non-guru GBCs were on islands. They had virtually no followers. The new people followed their gurus, and the temple presidents did not remain so if they were not also 100% kowtowing to the gurus. The temple presidents who did not have as their GBC a GBC guru placed their allegiance in the guru of the zone, not in the GBC zone. As such, with all the territory of the world now carved up into 11 zones, the GBC zones were nothing more than anachronisms that overlapped guru zones but were otherwise meaningless. The GBC of any such zone, and I'm referring here to the non-guru GBC, had to go along to get along. He was hoping for guru expansion, of course. But in 1979, there were no such prospects. With the guru contingent, led by the aggressive pseudo-debating style of Sri Dayananda, effectively crushing the opposition at Ramanreti in early 1979, prospects for non-guru GBCs becoming appointed to Guru-dom looked bleak. Whose territory would any such new acharya have given to him? Ocean's 11 all wanted to keep the share that they already had stolen via vitiated GBC imprimatur. None would be willing to give up a slice of their own pie. However, time changes things. There would be fall downs. Even previous to that, there would be in-house punishments of zonals who went too far, stretched the rubber band, and felt it snap in ways that embarrassed the remaining big guns. The power of the institution would creep back in, as it was always lurking underneath the whole facade anyway. But this was not at all apparent during the 1979 confrontation at Ramanreti. That was an exaltation of the greatness, so-called greatness, of course, of the glorified pretenders. E.N.E. describes it as follows, quote, Tamal Krishna, along with the other 10, falsely depicted the doubters to be little more than malicious barking dogs. He, meaning Tamal Krishna TKG, explained, since the disappearance of our beloved spiritual master, disenchanted persons come forward trying to cast doubt on the legacy left by Srila Prabhupada. When Srila Prabhupada appointed from among his senior disciples, 11 persons, to continue the process of initiation. And when, after their spiritual master's departure, those whom he selected assumed their duties by his command, the critics began to bark their discontent. Though they leveled their remarks against the successor gurus, notice successor here, though they leveled their remarks against the successor gurus, in reality, their criticism was aimed at Srila Prabhupada himself. The critics may argue that appointment alone is not a guarantee that one has actually achieved this perfectional stage of life. Prabhupada might have appointed disciples for lack of anyone better, or hoping that they might one day achieve the desired realization. To such irresponsible criticism, we answer a decisive no. Srila Prabhupada chose them because they merited his confidence, unquote. Now, although this is an excerpt from E&E and therefore is written by Doktorski, actually, it's almost entirely a 100% quote from TKG, so keep that in mind. Such a rascal hypocrite TKG was. As we pointed out last month, he, along with Kirtanananda, were the evil taproots primarily responsible for destroying Prabhupada's branch of the Hare Krishna movement in late 1977 and throughout the implementation stage of 1978. TKG did not know it at the time, but the other gurus and the rest of the GBC were about to come down on him, and they are about to come down on him hard. However, in February 1979, he was flying high, but soon to be shot down. He was soon to receive his first punishment. But that's another story for another time. We must stick with the immediate meanings, ramifications, and repercussions of that fateful confrontation at Ramanreti in February of 79. As already pointed out, although not all of the 11 great pretenders may have known it by that time, they all would come to know it, as would the rest of the movement. They had not known necessarily that they had not been recognized, selected, or appointed as Diksha Gurus. TKG certainly knew. Ocean's 11 had only been appointed Ritviks. There was no transitive device authorized by Prabhupada to automatically convert them into full-fledged Diksha Gurus. TKG knew this. He concocted and engineered that device, which was one of his own creation. He did so in advance. He planned it from the second week of July 1977, and, unfortunately, it worked like a charm. It got further empowered, in fact, when the Navadvip Mahant made a similar statement backing the concept in the spring of 1978. TKG, just see the hypocrisy. He knows what the actual fact is, but he claims the exact opposite in his barking dogs spiel. He knew that Prabhupada never selected any of them to be gurus, yet he intentionally claims otherwise. Then, adding injury to insult, he throws in the line about all of them being successors and not merely appointed to give initiation as madhyams, which was not the case either, because they were all sahajyas, causing only damage to the Krishna movement. They were light years away from being madhyams. TKG alleges that these so-called successors merited Prabhupada's confidence, and that is why he specifically and intentionally selected all of them to be his successors. TKG knew it, that everyone would buy into this propaganda, although a handful of malcontents, and he tags them as barking dogs, would not. This was the attitude. This is the attitude those men carried. The points raised by the opposition were valid. They should have been considered. But Paramatma did not allow any such reasonable dealing. Pride cometh before the fall. They were all going to be exposed, and the zonal debacle would crash and burn by the mid-80s. As pointed out earlier, amongst the so-called ISKCON leaders, Hangsaduta being the only exception, none of them could foresee that eventual outcome of this confrontation would be what it would be in due course of time. TKG's rant represented where most of them were at. Most of them were triumphalists in the winter of 1979. Sri Dayananda had led them to a major yet ultimately Pyrrhic victory, and he was rewarded for that by their stealing Pradyumna's seva and giving it to him, Sri Dayananda. Not all of the signatories apologized, but most of them did. We have pointed out one flaw already in this chapter, yet something else must be again considered. It deserves full reiteration. Doktorski could have skipped this episode entirely, and the vast majority of his readers, the readers of E&E, would have been blissfully unaware that he skipped it. He did not skip it, nor did he merely mention it in a couple of paragraphs in the next or previous chapters. He dedicated a whole chapter to it, called Crushing the Opposition. He thus put the incident on and for the record. It would not merge into oblivion. This was and remains yeoman's service to the cause of the accurate historical narrative of Prabhupada's branch of the Hare Krishna movement of Krishna consciousness. As such, I give Chapter 8 a straight A grade for that alone. The colossal hoax, known as the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, is a pseudo-spiritual scam. Evil men took over after Prabhupada's departure. He gave them numerous chances to rectify themselves voluntarily, but none of that took. The training was far from complete. None of the 11 great pretenders were genuine gurus, and none of their disciples were or are genuinely initiated. The world is now flooded with hundreds of bogus gurus and improperly initiated disciples posing as advanced bhaktas when they are no such thing. The final chance for rectification went down in Ramanreti in the winter of 1979. It was rejected. And the result thereafter is one transformation after another. They all showed their true colors at that Asat Sabha in Prabhupada's quarters that fateful day, and you can read all about it in Chapter 8 of E&E. I highly recommend that you do so. Sadeva Samya